Let's go.
You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
Podcast listeners, Al Martin here. Welcome back to Making Data Simple. Today, I have Ayal Steinberg. He's the general manager of technical community and client engineering here at IBM. Yes, another IBM podcast. It is fantastic to have Ayal back on the podcast. Last time we had him, we were talking about how to drive sales team excellence. This time, as I said, I bring Ayal back in a new role, GM Technical Community and Client Engineering. We'll see how it goes. I love the way Ayal thinks. I love the way he drives business. I love to debate and learn from Ayal as well. What I thought I'd do is first half, I'm going to talk about business. Second half on leadership. Ayal, I think this is like the third time you've been on. Is that right? Third or fourth?
You know, it's either second or third, but each time is great. I'm sure if we spend some time looking, we'll probably figure out it's either two or three. I think this is my third. If you were going to make me make
it's
a pick.
Third.
We all know that the pyramid that we run is upside down. So let's make no mistake about it. I am as anxious and nervous because I am in service to you. So I really appreciate the invite and agree with everything you said. Let's have some fun and kind of cover some good topics.
We will. Well, look, I'll jump right in there if you're good. Look, previous you led client sales, and I asked a ton of sales-related questions the last two times. And by the way, listeners, if you haven't listened to that, you've got to go back. We'll make reference to those in the show notes, but you got to go back and listen. There were some gems in there. But now you have technical community and client engineering. Rather than me describing the role, I would like you, if you would, describe this new role, and if you would, either embed or talk to it distinctly, the major differences that you see between client sales and technical sales.
Great. And so first, I love the words you're using, and I appreciate that. Most people might not be familiar with client sales. Technical sales is a thing, and I think people kind of get it. You know, I just, when I first came into the role, I hated when people talked about the technical salespeople. Then this other group, some people called it sellers, right? Like there was the sellers. Are you a seller or are you a technical seller? And I think if we're going to really follow that words matter, everybody's in sales. There's a sales team and there's the technical sales. And we kind of had to think of a name for this other group, and client sellers jumped out. Not everybody loves it, but when I use them, client sellers, technical sellers, part of one single sales team. You know, I actually am really humbled and honored to be at the helm of this organization, this team. I think there's two real reasons why I say that. First is that customers have said to us that they want much more experiential experiences, or kind of shoulder to shoulder as opposed to nose. And while the client seller is really, really important in that model, right? Making sure we get access to the right person, it's set up in the right way, navigating all the politics in the economic and political part of the sales cycle, and ultimately proving ROI, which I know, Al, I'm sure there'll be some challenger seller questions that come up. I know you're a huge fan of it, but a lot of that is in the domain of the client seller. The other part of it, though, is that I want to create something, right? I don't just show me a bunch of PowerPoint presentations and let me extrapolate what that means for me. There's a concept that I've been using lately of like the last mile. So give me something that bridges what looks like it comes from the store to what it would look like in my environment. And if I have a somewhat peculiar, unique use case, like help me make that come to life and let me see that. So I think that's one, right? The customers are much more experimental. I hate that word, but they want to work and see things. I think the second for me personally is I actually started my career in technical sales. I was with a small startup. I was from industry. I was working in retail in the buying and planning offices. And I switched over to about a 20-person company that it was like a first go-to-market role. We didn't even have technical pre-sales. We had delivery, and then delivery became technical sales. And I remember that experience. That company got acquired by Oracle in 2005, and I went over to be some level of management on the technical sales team as we put three companies together in that go-to-market. And I remember switching over to sales. And my experience from that time was you could say the exact same thing as a technical seller and everybody believed you. The exact same words could come out of your mouth if you introduce yourself as a client seller or a typical seller, and nobody believed you. They looked at the technical seller. So I think now that I'm on this side, I'm hoping to get my credibility back. And, it's kind of in a way coming home. But the fact that I had the last 15 or so years in a client sales role, I feel like it's not a switch, but it's an enhancement, right? How do I build on both experiences and kind of bridge the gap and figure out what this role looks like in today's time.
Silly question, but
Please.
do you always need sales and technical sales? Like at IBM here, we have a one-to-one relationship. But like you mentioned, as a startup, would those roles be combined? Would they ever be combined? Or you think they're always distinct?
I think right now, if somebody asked me to do I need both? I would say yes. Today you need both, and they're very different. And you could adjust the ratios of how many you have. Like, do you have one person who's a client seller and one person a technical seller, or do you have 5 technical sellers and 5 client sellers? Like that really depends on what you're selling, the size of the market, how complex the product is. There's an old saying that I think came out of the EMC days where they said, if you have really great products, you don't need really great sellers. If you have really complex, complicated, somewhat rough around the edges products, you need really great sellers. And that I use that sellers to mean both client sellers and technical seller. So I think right now you probably need both roles. The exact ratios you could probably adjust. Maybe you get away with one client seller if you're doing like really large enterprise projects that have a big breadth of footprint, and maybe 2 or 3 technical sellers, depending on how specialization. If it's a simpler product with a simpler space, you probably get away with one technical seller to support many client sellers. I do think at some point, though, that with the creation of product-led growth and just more self-service interactions and some really amazing companies that have proven that model to work, that the client seller is becoming less and less, though they hit a point in their TAM or in their target market where to sell to the enterprise, 80% of the job is actually herding the cats in a big company, right? And it's more around making sure information is being shared across the customer's company, that it's not so much about like small kind of like, hey, let me write up an order for you. But there is something around helping companies that are complicated bridge different parts and make sure that the ROI is well understood to help that company actually buy better. So I think the long way of answering, Al, is that there's probably going to be a need for both of them. I think we're going to see fluctuation in how many of each we need depending on the product. And the more that the web e-commerce experience, I think that's going to strengthen or kind of change things on one segment of the market. But I think the enterprise is always going to need a little bit of hand-holding.
Thank you for that. So let me ask you this, though. You say you started with tech sales. Great. And then you moved to client sales. How long have you been in client sales now? Like, as a pause to the listeners, again, we're not going to go through the intro. Go back to the previous interviews I've done with Ayal. We'll put it in the show notes. But how long have you been in client sales versus technical sales now?
So I was in technical sales for about 5 years. And then I was in individual contributing client sales for about 1.5 to 2 years. And then I became a sales leader, goodness, for the last 15 or so years, maybe a little bit longer than that. So it's been those 2 years as individual contributing sales were probably some of my highest earning years when I look back over the time. I then became a sales leader, and I just got to work with a lot of really great people. But I would say in the 20 or so years, probably 3/4 of it has been in client sales, and probably 25% of it has been in technical sales.
Do you ever long for going back to those independent contributor sales roles?
I don't think so. I think in the beginning you did, there's total advantages to it. And I have some great friends who are lifelong individual contributor salespeople, and they are really happy. Probably the biggest benefit is you get to decide where you spend your time. And, there's not a lot of people who are kind of deciding when you're going to do certain things. I think when you get into management, as you kind of climb up, you're much more dependent on other folks and schedules, and you're just much more busy. That doesn't always mean great in terms of impact, but you're always much busy. I like the impact that I can make as a sales leader. I feel like there comes a point where it doesn't become about your personal impact, but your impact is the multiplication that you could create into the organization. When I first came to IBM, it was a bigger opportunity than I ever had at the time. And I had a good piece of wisdom from someone who said, you're going to be tempted to kind of carry the load on your back. And if you crush it, you might do 20, 30, $40 million. But with a several billion-dollar number, it doesn't make a difference. That 30, 40 million doesn't make a difference. But if you can get everybody 5 or 10% more productive, then you're talking about major impact to the business. And that was about 4 years ago. That was really helpful, right? So I spend more of my time now thinking about reducing friction for the masses of sellers and technical sellers out there. Like, how do we just make everybody a little bit more productive because there's one less obstacle that they have to overcome? Or two, how do you start increasing the productivity of the folks, not just because they're doing less bad things more often or just becoming, less friction, but they're actually better because they have the right skills, you're hiring for the right DNA, and you just get a unstoppable workforce. And then, that's also really fun. So I think for me, in trading the impact that I could have now versus kind of the personal impact, it's a no-brainer for me. I would always take the ability to multiply and kind of impact other people more than my personal impact.
Impact, influence, and scale. I understand that. Let me ask you this then. So, discounting the independent contributor roles, you're 5 to 15, so 3/4 of the career spent in client sales. Now you're back to technical sales, so to speak. Is there anything you first notice? I mean, this is like not IBM specific. We're talking to all the people that listen to the podcast out there. But coming back to technical sales, any profound insight that hits you right off the bat?
Yeah, great question. There are great people on both sides, really, really great people on both sides. I find the technical people, sometimes they get a reputation of being more introverted than extroverted. I don't think that's necessarily always the case. I think technical salespeople really, really, really care about the impact and the outcome that the customers are making. Like client sellers, I think, listen, they care also, but I think sometimes there might be some that are more motivated about personal income or kind of recognition. I feel like technical sellers are more driven by the customer's outcome and making a difference, like making the world better. Hopefully that doesn't come off cheesy, but I think that's one. I think the second, and this might be an IBM thing, I don't know, I'm guessing it's probably common, is technical sales folks usually pretty process driven, maybe electrical engineers or something in the same discipline, very focused on targets and outcomes. And Alan, we've joked around this before, is that sometimes the target and outcome becomes the thing, and people lose context to the whole point, right? And the analogy I use is they're going after the cheese table and they're missing all the good seafood that's on the right, and they're walking by it because they're going for the cheese because that's what they committed to. I think that idea of kind of remembering the intent and the point, and maybe being a little bit less of a rule follower to, you maybe miss one metric that might be the focus metric, but you actually win the battle and win the war.
To be clear on your full role, though, you've got technical sales, which I'm responsible for. You've got client engineering. You've got enablement. You've got the community. Anything you want to say about some of the others? I'm going to go into some IBM vision next, but any other comments as to the extent of the role?
Let me just throw two other groups so that way anybody who's listening doesn't feel slated if I don't cover them.
Yes.
We have a really important group called Tech Zone, which is basically all of the tools that we use to run our operations, which is a really, really important business. Like think of it as a production deployment of a lot of our software. We're probably the largest customer of ourselves to satisfy, all of the go-to-market functions. So that team is really important too. And you said developers, but we also have a really large team of how we actually show up with the user and the developer, which comes in terms of something called Tech Exchange, which is our event, but it's also our user community and our champions, as well as, how we're working with builders and developers. So I think, Al, sorry, that was bouncing in my head that I didn't want to lose that part.
So here's some follow-on questions then. Now that you've made the switch, any advice you'd give to your client sales leader, the new individual that comes in relative to what you've learned?
Great question. I would say this goes back to experience like 20-something years ago, that the desire for any good technical salesperson is to be viewed as the doctor. And I use that analogy thinking like the family doctor, super trusted. But the reason you trust the doctor is because you don't walk into the office and they just prescribe the treatment right off the bat. There's this like discovery, hey, tell me about yourself. What's ailing you? What hurts? Let me do some checkout. Let me take some blood work. Okay, here's what I'm seeing, and let me give you a recommendation. Like if, there's an old saying that says, if people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I think technical sales really does that well, and establish a really great technical seller in terms of client engineering or ecosystem or development. Anyone who listens first and comes with a personalized message based on the outcome of that person, like that's worth its weight in gold. And that's how people get trusted. What I would say to the client sales team is give that person space. So create the opportunity for them to engage, and then let them do their thing and enter into conversations that probably you might want to be in, but maybe it's better if you're not in. And think about a divide and conquer strategy where there's some work that the client seller is doing, the technical seller is doing something else, but let them kind of exert their domain. And it's not a competition. It's a better together, and I think that's really, really important, right? Is giving people the space to be able to do their thing. And don't think of this as duplicate or overlapping roles, but these are very specialized, different roles that when done together is like an orchestra, right? Much better than kind of listening to one musician play their song.
So you've been in the role like five months, is that right? Something like that?
Yeah. It feels
5
longer,
months.
but it's been 5 months. Yeah, it's been 5
It
months.
feels long. So what's the most difficult decision? Can you talk to it? I mean, something that you say, hey, this was the most difficult decision I had to make in the current role within those 5 months.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And, I think I'm going to give you an answer that's going to be unsatisfying. But I think what I'm learning more and more now is the things that differentiate companies at some level is strategy. And it might seem simple, but strategy to me is not what you're going to do. Everybody, let's just say every competitor has the same access to resources and the same amount of time and a lot of sames. What makes somebody different is what makes you unique. And I think for me, looking at the business, it's thinking about our differentiators and doing more of those things, but also doing less of the things that are somewhat commoditized. And I think that's the hardest thing, Al, is like calling your shots as a leader, right? 3 things we're going to do and 3 things we are not going to do anymore. And the 3 things that are not going to do anymore, I think it's like not just about the leader saying they're not going to do it, but making sure that the structure set up so that the rest of the company, all of the people that you don't ever interact with, know that they have permission to stop doing things, to free up time to do the things that actually matter. So for me, that's empowering the organization to stop doing low value things that we might have done for 20 years and people feel like it's the basis of how they get paid and how they be compensated. And maybe they are set up that way in specific markets or specific countries. So I think it's, how do we spread the message to every single country, for every single person on the team, that they have empowerment, that they could stop doing certain things that they've been doing forever to free up time for higher value strategic things that we could all do together?
Could I put you on the spot and ask you one of the areas that to stop doing that you'd say right now?
Sure. So what I think the biggest sin of any large organization is there's a feel to have a memory contest, right? Or there's information about the deal, about the meeting, about whatever has such a high premium that it perpetuates throughout the organization. And the tax to be able to answer the question at the moment somebody might ask you is potentially hours, depending on your role. And what I mean by that is, think about if you feel that you would be exposed because you didn't have the latest update on a deal that honestly, you weren't even driving the impact of that, right? Maybe somebody else has got it covered, but who else along the chain feels they have to know every single detail in case they're asked for it? The tax on that is tremendous. So how do you fix that? You don't fix that by telling the individual not to do it, because as long as there's a fear that they're going to be asked and exposed, they will. You got to go up the chain to the leadership to make it clear to them to say, hey, we don't ask this question anymore. Or I don't have an expectation. I want to know trends. I want to know, of all the customers that you visited, here is what we're seeing around competition, around what market requirements are. That's good to know. But I will never ask you about a specific deal for this quarter. Of course, that only works in aggregate. Like, it doesn't work for the person who's driving the deal. But think about any big company. I know you do it too, Al, right? How much time do people spend on calls, listening, taking notes in case they're asked for a question on a deal that they had nothing to do with? Nothing. So that's what I mean. That takes courage, honestly, to be able to stop, to say to somebody when asked, especially if they're really senior in the organization, hey, listen, I really don't know, but I'm spending my time somewhere else. I could get you the answer if it's important, or I could put you in touch. But let me tell you about this other thing that I'm working on, which I think has a higher, multiple across. And, it might not come this quarter, but goodness, this could really be game changing. Like, that takes a lot of courage.
To your point, we sometimes forget as leaders, when we ask something of the team, they spend an enormous amount of hours to come back with that material. We don't realize one simple meeting, maybe 30 minutes, it takes 8 hours of somebody prepping to get to that meeting. And maybe or maybe not will they be asked that question you mentioned. but they'll
I
still
totally
do
agree.
it to make sure they have the answer, right?
I totally agree. And Al, I know some of your listeners are IBMers and some are not. I got to imagine this is for sure true in a lot of big companies.
Yep.
I also think this is true in small companies. And I listen to a lot of podcasts and I try to stay kind of current outside of just big companies. And I spend still in my career, I spend more time in smaller companies than I have in bigger companies. So is this just a big company thing? Like, I don't think so. Like, I think there's so much inefficiency where people are spending a tremendous amount of like resources on low yield activity because they feel like they have to, where it's like activity is good. How many calls did you make? How many emails did you write? Like, how many frogs did you kiss before you found the prince or princess, right? Like, I would actually argue that smaller companies, it's even more dangerous because you have such limited resources. There's no way you have enough time to get to everything you need to do. So I think this applies to everyone, right? And it's not just a leader's responsibility. It's not just a manager's responsibility or a individual contributor's responsibility. I think if people spend as much time thinking about what they're going to stop doing as what they should be doing, man, the productivity across the board go way up.
100%. 100%. All right, I'm going to pivot. Speaking of strategy, I wanted to get your view on what the state of IBM is. Vision, long-term outlook. What's the IL version?
Oh,
What does it
goodness.
look like?
So Al, first, if I could just throw something in there, I listened to my last podcast and I said, God, I'm so serious. Like I wish, when you and I are we joke a lot and we actually have a lot of fun. So let's, extra bonus points for you if you crack a few smiles or jokes along as we go here. But so strategy. So how do I feel about the strategy and then the strategy itself? I'm really, really optimistic about this moment in time with IBM. And like I mentioned before, I listen to a lot of podcasts and it drives me nuts when I think about historical companies. Like, you think about Apple and when they started in the 70s and 80s, like IBM had the biggest single largest market cap of any company in 1980. And then you think about like other companies that came away, IBM is like in the background for a lot of these companies. And we're an iconic company that many of the largest institutions in the world and governments and banks and insurance companies and retailers trust their entire business in IBM. And I'm so proud to have that ability. There's also another side of IBM, which is this reinvention and constant reinvention and innovation that is in our DNA, right? We've been through multiple cycles where we always are there. And some of it we're a little bit too late, let's be honest. Some of it we're a little bit too early. I feel like right now we have a new CEO who started 4 years ago. Happened to be a month after I started, February of 2020. Pandemic was March of 2020, if you could kind of put your head around how much change that was as a new CEO. And Arvind Krishna, he did an amazing job of calling two things. And I hear this often back in the 2020. People ask, what is IBM known for? You got a lot of different answers. Probably the most common was laptops, which is a business we got out of years and years ago. Now, hopefully, if people ask, what is IBM known for? They'll say one of two things, hybrid cloud and AI. And hopefully everybody would say that same answer, not just me. 4 years ago, that seemed a little bit like, whoa, is he right? Is he not right? Right? There was single clouds, like everybody was kind of moving towards AWS or Azure or GCP. The idea of multi-cloud, kind of on-premises still being around, like that was a little bit controversial, largely on the back of Red Hat and OpenShift. The ability to be able to deliver a true hybrid cloud experience has turned out to be true. And I think we are the undeniable winner in this space. So I feel really good about that. AI 2020, pre-ChatGPT, pre all this other stuff. Like we've been in this space for a long time. There were presentations in 2018, 19, where we're talking about foundation models, right? The world opened up in, I guess it was November of 2021, largely based on OpenAI bringing ChatGPT out, where it was like 50, 60% right. And because of the use case, it was probably okay, right? Like consumer use cases, whatever they were doing, IBM would never have the permission to be 60, 70% right on anything. There's an expectation from our customers that we're going to be right a lot. So I feel really good that the calls that we made 4 years ago happened to be the right calls. And now we're aligning around them. That doesn't mean the rest of the stuff's not important. For sure it is. And I could talk about the analogies of, how the iPod or the iPhone is like 95% of Apple's commercials, advertising, but it's like 40% of the revenue. I don't know if those numbers are 100% right, but directionally right.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing, right? Hybrid cloud AI, that is our iPhone lead with, but there is a lot of really amazing, iconic, like truly legendary software infrastructure, Z, power, storage, consulting. Like, I couldn't feel prouder to be part of this team at this moment. And I feel like we are right on point with our strategy.
To your point, it all starts with, the theme of the day is really AI. But then once you get into AI, you're talking automation, you're talking to security, you're talking to the infrastructure that supports it. I mean, it's just the entire stack, which IBM has like nobody else. That's why I'm still here. Hey folks, Al here. I am going to break this one up. I have a lot more questions to ask Ayal. I love talking with Ayal. Next week, stay tuned because we're going to talk about the state of AI. We're going to talk about open and closed models, new and exciting tech, emerging tech, what he's fearful of. It's going to be great. So stay tuned for next week. See you. Bye.